Good morning. Today we're going to read chapters 9 and 10 of The Chocolate Touch. Now we left off where poor John was trying to play his solo with his trumpet, and it had all turned to chocolate, and the kids started making fun of him, so he ran out. So let's see what happens. Oh, the shame of it. The humiliation. John wept breathlessly as he ran. Okay, wept means cried. Shocked and frightened, indignant and angry at the world that had suddenly turned against him. Mean old things, John thought, blaming Miss Plimsoll and Miss Quaver for his failures, even though nothing that had happened to him had been their fault in any way. Horrible old school, he thought, even though he had liked school until that morning. Hateful Susan, he thought, even though he knew at the same time that he was really longing for her to be friendly with him again. Through the window, Mrs. Midas saw John coming up the pathway. "Hello, John dear," she called from the living room. "You're home early today. How nice. As a reward, there'll be a piece of chocolate after supper." "I hate it," John shouted. He was crying too hard to say anything else for a moment. When she heard the sound of his voice, Mrs. Midas rushed into the hall. "Why, what's the matter, dear?" she asked, putting her arm around him. John twisted away from her grasp, ran past her, and started up the stairs toward his bedroom. "Susan doesn't want me at her birthday party," he said as he went. "I know she doesn't. Well, I don't want to go to her rotten old party anyway." "I don't think you really mean that," Mrs. Midas said. "Besides," she added, and John was halted by the softness of her voice. Okay, and halted means stop in your tracks, like just stop what you're doing. "Mrs. Buttercup just telephoned to say she was going to drive over herself at 4 o'clock to pick you up." "She did?" John said, blinking down at his mother from the top of the stairway. "Yes, she did," Mrs. Midas assured him, "so you better hurry and get yourself washed and brushed. Your party clothes are laid out on your bed." There were games on the Buttercup's lawn while it was still warm enough outside. Later, the party supper, including the birthday cake, was going to be served indoors, and there would be a magician and a short movie. John joined in the blind man's buff and grandmother's footsteps and fox and geese, and soon he became more cheerful. He even temporarily forgot about chocolate. Susan looked very pretty. Her yellow curls had been brushed so hard that they looked silkier than ever. She was wearing a big blue ribbon, the same color as her eyes. Her cheeks were flushed with excitement, a deeper pink than her new party dress. On her feet were dainty little white socks and white shoes with straps that buttoned. Between games, Susan smiled at John and said, "I'm glad you came." They seemed to be on good terms again. Then Mr. Buttercup approached, bringing a bucket of water from the garage. He set it down in the middle of the lawn without spilling a single drop. "We're going to duck for apples," Susan whispered to John. "The boys against the girls. You could be the captain of the boys' team." The two teams lined up for the race, Susan leading the girls and John the boys. "The idea is," Mr. Buttercup explained, "when I say go, not yet, John, Susan and John will run to the bucket. There are 12 apples floating in the bucket and 12 people in the race. Using only their teeth, Susan and John will grab their apples and run back to their lines. As soon as they touch the hands of the number 2 runners in their teams, Dinny and Duncan, Susan and John will go to the end of their lines, and Dinny and Duncan will run to the bucket to duck for apples. Do you all understand the way it's going to work? All right, 1, 2, get ready. 1 to get ready, 2 to get steady, and 3 to go." Susan bounded ahead like a jackrabbit and had her face deep in the bucket by the time John reached her side and crouched down for his apple. He got his eye on a big red one with its stalk jutting up conveniently for him to grab. He lowered his face, opened his mouth, and lunged. Somehow his nose reached the apple before his teeth did and pushed it below the surface of the water. John's mouth followed the apple down. Then a terrible thing happened. The clear water in the bucket turned into dark brown, sweet liquid chocolate. Susan and John immediately pulled their heads up, but it was too late. Their faces were drenched with chocolate syrup. "Oh," Susan exclaimed, wiping chocolate out of her eyes. Chocolate syrup dripped down all over her delicate pale pink dress. "Oh," she moaned. John was in the same state. There was chocolate all over his face. There was chocolate on his white shirt front and on his gray flannel shorts. And there was chocolate in his mouth. "Glug," John said, "glug." Susan was too surprised and angry to speak. For the second time that day, she turned her back on John and ran away from him. Mrs. Buttercup offered to clean John up, but he couldn't bear to stay at the party another minute. He started off at once for home. Chapter 10. Dragging along and thinking of all the dreadful things that had happened, John had walked about halfway home when he heard the cheery voice of his father. "Hello, hello," called Mr. Midas, crossing over from the other side of the street. He was on his way home from the station. "You left the party rather early, didn't you? What?" Mr. Midas had just seen the patches and streaks of chocolate that were drying on John's face and on his clothes. "Good gracious," he said. "No wonder you left the party early. How did that happen?" John burst into tears. It had all been so awful, but now that he could tell his father about his terrible day, he stopped crying and only sniffed a little, and then as he told the whole story, about taking the coin to the candy store, about buying the box that had turned out to have only one chocolate in it, about the toothpaste, about breakfast, the gloves, the silver dollar, the pencil, the lunch, the trumpet, and finally the apple ducking water. "You mean to tell me they really all turned to chocolate?" Mr. Midas asked. "You sure you didn't imagine some of this?" "Oh, no," John assured him. "Well," Mr. Midas said, still looking doubtful, "we're only a couple of blocks from that candy store of yours. Not that I've ever noticed one there. Suppose we stroll over and ask the man whether his chocolates always do strange things to people." "It's on the next corner," John said, recognizing some of the houses on the side street. "Not the next house, not the next house, not the next," he said, but John's voice faded into silence. The corner where he had found the candy store was nothing now but an empty lot. Flat, open ground littered with a pile of rusty tin cans and broken bottles around a splintery old sign saying "For Sale." Said Mr. Midas, frowning anxiously at John. "I think we'd better pay a visit to Dr. Cranium before we go home." "That's where the store was, though," John protested, beginning to cry again. He had shed more tears in that one day, it seemed, and certainly eaten more chocolate than in all the other days of his life put together. "I know it was." Dr. Cranium was a busy man. As luck would have it, however, he was able to see Mr. Midas and John almost at once. "Well, well, well," said Dr. Cranium. "And how are we getting along now, John? Have we cut down on our candy, eh?" "How do you do?" John responded dully. "Apparently he has had a bad day, Dr. Cranium," Mr. Midas said. "Trouble at school, you know, and a little accident at a birthday party. What I'm worried about is that he keeps saying that everything he puts into his mouth turns to chocolate." "No more than a nursery fantasy, I'm sure," Dr. Cranium said to Mr. Midas. "Well, John," he went down, looking down with a smile, "suppose you tell me in your own words what the matter seems to be." "Everything I put into my mouth turns to chocolate," John explained. "Everything I eat and everything I drink changes into chocolate. I'm thirsty and I'm getting a pain, a bad one, I think." Dr. Cranium sighed patiently and invited John to open his mouth and say "ah." "Ah," John said. Dr. Cranium peered into John's mouth briefly and gave a low whistle of surprise. "This chocolate eating simply must stop." He went to a supply cabinet. "I don't think there's any time to be lost," he told Mr. Midas. "I'm going to give the boy some of my own special compound. Dr. Cranium's elixir, I call it. Never fails." Dr. Cranium selected a large bottle from one of the cabinet's crowded shelves. He removed the top from the bottle. He got a spoon from another shelf. He filled the spoon with an oily, greenish-yellowish medicine that had yellowish-reddish lights glinting in it. "It doesn't taste very pleasant," Dr. Cranium warned John in a pleasant tone of voice, "but I'm sure it'll do the trick. Clear the stomach and you clear the mind. That's what I always say." Dr. Cranium offered John the brimful spoon. "Must I?" John asked his father. "I know it'll turn to chocolate." "Go on," Mr. Midas nodded encouragingly. "Drink it down." John took the spoon between his lips. This medicine turned to chocolate. The spoon turned to chocolate. John choked and spluttered, and chocolate syrup spurted from his mouth. Dr. Cranium dropped the spoon in alarm. When it struck the white tiled floor and the chocolate handle snapped into several pieces. "Mercy," said Dr. Cranium. "I've never seen anything like it. The boy's whole system seems to be so chocolified that it chocolifies everything it touches." After he had recovered somewhat, the doctor went on. "I believe this must be an unprecedented case of, chocolatitis. I shall call it Cranium's disease. I shall want to make an exhaustive study of the child. I think John has had enough excitement for one day," Mr. Midas said. So poor John still does not have a solution to his problem. He still has the problem that everything he puts in his mouth turns to chocolate. So hopefully in the next few chapters we find a solution, because even the doctor wasn't sure about it until it actually happened in front of him. So we have two vocabulary words. We had wept, which means cried, And halted, which means stop in your tracks. Stop what you're doing. There were, a couple new characters. Mr. and Mrs. Buttercup were in there, which we could add to the list because they did kind of have speaking parts. And now we could also add a setting to our list, which is Susan's house. Because that's where the party was. Oops. Sorry about that. So Susan's house is a new setting that just occurred in chapters 9 and 10. All right, you're going to go answer some questions on this story. Good luck.